You know when John wrote? John, we just talked about John 3:16.
I think it's up there, isn't it? No, it's right on the PowerPoint there.
After Jesus? I just, this is not all what I plan to say, but I just think the Creator has such an amazing sense of humor. There is no passage that could have upset me more than the one he used to illustrate. Absolutely no passage in the Bible. It's the one where I grind my teeth every time I hear it and think that dude, whoever wrote that, had no relationship with Jesus at all, or would never have said that. Jesus never thought he was God. He pointed to. Does that fit with what some of you learned? Fit with what I learned. And yet this passage is often used to batter people. And so I'm furious right now. All the lovely, gentle things I plan to say, I have to start out dealing with John 3:16. I just think that's funny. It's really funny. And that reminds me of one thing I was going to say. When I was a Danny grad, I had a Danforth Fellowship for a year after I graduated from college. I could not fill out the applications for medical school because I knew there was something wrong with medicine. And so I didn't know what to do, and the dean called me in and offered me a Danforth Fellowship for a year, or to nominate me. And I just knew that was what I needed to do, was for a year of this program that doesn't exist anymore in Danforth, but it was for young Christian women who take a year out, not to be academic, be sent to a school at least 1,000 miles from where we live and where we'd gone to school, which put me in the east. We had two responsibilities: to grow as a person and to be of service to the campus. Wonderful. And that's what I did. And I had no question but what I would be, except that they had like over 600 or 700 recommended, and they chose 16. And that was a leap of faith. That was a leap of faith. And my life has been that way. All of it has been that way. I'm now 84 years old. I think I'm going on 85. We'll see what happens with this cancer thing. One of the things that I could see when they told me I told the doctors I had cancer for a year, but they didn't believe me because they don't think I know anything. And then finally I got it confirmed. I can see how I contributed to this disease and where I am now. And I also can contribute to my healing. So when I was at the undergrad, one of the things I did was a World University Service, which works with college students all over the world. I knew the director in New York, and he lost some of his staff, and so he asked me as part of my service, would I be willing to go to make speeches in various parts of, sort of my area. And so I agreed to do that. And he sent me to the school. I think it was somewhere in West Virginia. But I took a plane, a train, a bus, and then I just expected the next thing to be a donkey cart or something. I didn't know where I was going. And I got there, and the whole campus came out to hear me, which impressed me. And the guy who introduced me, or who spoke before I did, actually said something that I'm now borrowing. And what he said was, I feel like a mosquito in a nudist colony. I know what I want to do, but I'm not sure how to do it. And that's kind of how I feel. I know exactly what I want to do, and I'm not sure that I know how to do it. So if any of you starts itching, well, that might be a good sign. I'm really happy to be back in Minnesota. And noticed immediately that I knew how to pronounce it. And I spent much of my life here in Minnesota. When I first started working with addictions, to me Minnesota was like Mecca. And but it wasn't just that. A lot of people signed up to work with me from Minnesota, and I did an intensive every year here, 9-day intensive for many years. And it was Minnesota that birthed my first book. I was a confirmed non-writer, and gave speeches. I like to talk. I'm Cherokee. I like to talk. And my college professor in my comp class used to read my papers as how not to write. So I was, needless to say, a bit traumatized by that. And luckily I had a German professor for my next English class, and she let me do all my reports orally because I was so traumatized. And so after I wrote Women's Reality, well, they came to me and they had recorded my speeches and transcribed. And they came to me and asked if I would write a book. And then after I wrote the book, I waited to die. I thought, okay, I've done it. This is what you asked. I did the best I could. And I could die now because I did what you wanted me to do. And then came the idea for the next book. And my whole feeling was, what do you want of me? And 17 books later, I'm saying, okay, what's the next? Feel very good about it. So I have lived a life of faith. When I first went to college, I had lived and grown up in Cherokee country, been surrounded by Cherokee. I had been with my family, and my father did research for the government, so I had this close-knit unit that moved around together. And when I went to college, I called my parents and I said, you haven't prepared me for this culture. Who are these people? And I'm still saying that. Who are these people? Because, and I'm sure some of the Native people in the room can identify with this. Because what we've done in Western culture is so different. And it's only been in the past few years that I've realized that I just wasn't part of this culture in a way, that I was outside of. And I'm so grateful that for everything that has happened to me in this life. I'm so grateful to be here because it was Minnesota that published my first book, Winston Press. It was Minnesota where I was sitting in the Sofitel, just right next door, kind of, having dinner with a friend, and someone screamed, "My God, it's Ann Wilson Schaaf!" And the whole dining room quit eating. They all stared. They ran over for autographs. And I wanted to die. I wanted to die. I couldn't wait. I always, and that started a process for me, which Ed mentioned, was that I then was later speaker at the first codependence, conference on codependence, national conference, and there were, I don't know, 1,000, 2,000 people there. And when I finished speaking, 400 of them wanted to speak to me personally. When I had answered as many questions as I could and was ready to pee on the floor, I apologized and said, "Please, I need to go to the bathroom." And only 40 people followed me into the bathroom. And only 2 could get in the stall with me. And I said, there is something wrong with this. There is something wrong with this. And so I waited in the stall with the door locked for 45 minutes. And when I walked across I had to, there was no way to get to my room that I knew without going through the lobby. And when I walked through the lobby, I was everybody's new best friend, just like, you know how Trump has all of these people who are now friends with him, very close. Well, they were there. And so I went and hid in my room for a while, waiting for the next speaker. And I wanted to hear him, and so I waited till he'd started, and then I listened a few minutes and thought, and so I thought it's a good time to get in the hot tub and just see where I am. And I was in the hot tub, and 2 women screamed, "There's Ann Wilson Schaaf," and jumped in the hot tub with me with their clothes on. And I would try to be polite and respond and answer their questions. And I went and packed my bag and went off into the desert and prayed. And I said, I don't want to do this. And I quit giving speeches, and I quit doing workshops. And I said, I have to get my head on straight about all this. And it took me about 20 years. And a big part of that was recovery. I was in Minnesota again, and I was speaking at some banquet, and I just realized that one of our family members, I was living in a household with women and our children, single women and our children, feminists, very feminist. And I just realized that I didn't know anything about addiction, and I was suspicious that one of us was an addict. And so I wasn't sure what to do about that, because in my doctoral training, which I thought was very good, and I interned at Bellevue Hospital in New York, I knew all about schizophrenia. We even had a category for a pseudo-normal schizophrenic. But I didn't know anything about addiction. And so, not knowing that it was gauche, I asked the women at the table how many of them were alcoholic. And I think there were 8 of us, or 10 of us, Anyway, all but one raised her hand. And I said, oh my God, I am so ignorant. I am so ignorant. And so I tried to learn about addiction, and I was just in that early stages. And of course, Minnesota was the mecca of addiction, you know, then with Hazelden and everything. And so I went home and I did an intervention. Now, I would probably not recommend this in the future. She was coming into the bathroom and I was going out. And so I figured I had the upper hand since she was under a little more pressure. And I said, I think you're an alcoholic. And she said, as she wanted to get past me into the bathroom, she said, I think you're right. Well, so I immediately ran to the phone and called Minnesota and said, what do I do now? And they said, treatment. She goes to treatment. I said, okay, yeah. They said, okay. Okay. And off she went. I saw to that. I had no control issues. And then they told me I was as sick as she was. And I said, bullshit. But I also was going to do all the right things. So I said, okay. And they said, you need treatment too. Because you have been affected by the disease. You didn't cause it, but you've been affected. You have your own disease, which I do, codependence. And you need treatment. So I thought, okay, we'll do treatment. So I announced to the household, everybody here is going to treatment. I told my secretary, you have to go to treatment too, because I'm sure I've affected you and everything. I called my ex-husband, and I said, I think you need to go to treatment. Told my kids, I had a very large private practice as a psychologist, psychotherapist at that point. And I figured I must have affected my clients. So I told them that if they felt that that would be good for them, that they were invited to come to treatment too. At my expense. And we had so many people that no treatment center would take us. And so what I did was I rented a motel, and they came to us. They sent staff and did treatment with us. With all the time underneath my mumbling to myself, I'm the one that kept things together. I'm the one that does taking care of raising these kids. I'm the one that, you know, it was really a hard thing for me to swallow. And I started going to 12-step meetings. Well, first I started Al-Anon. But what Cherokee woman wants to be part of the auxiliary? Not me. So I started going to AA meetings. But I went as a trained professional. I took my yellow pad, which goes with me everywhere, and I was going to take notes. Now, I nearly died of smoke inhalation on it. I'm allergic to tobacco smoke. Being an Indian, that's tough. But I kept at it. I kept at it. And I watched, because I said, this works. I don't know why it works, but this works. I'm going to find out why it works. And I want to tell you my first, most important learning that I learned in 12-step programs. it was about participation. There was no way I was going to find out how that program worked by watching, observing. I'm an acute observer. I don't miss much. I'm getting blinder and deafer and all that, so I'm missing a little bit more, but not so bad. I still don't miss much. And I wouldn't even get it. And I got that in order for me to get this program, I have to participate. I have to get a sponsor. I have to work the steps. I have to be honest. Honest, honest, honest. You notice that and think, I like that part, that's it. And I have to be sincere about this. And this one thing shifted my entire life from being a professional, which many of you are, God rest your soul, and you hold on to it for dear life, God rest your soul, and it keeps you different, better than, separated from, not like the others, just a little cut maybe, but a little cut above. And so what I learned was I'm never going to get it this way. I'm never going to get it this way. I have to really work on myself and participate. And then that took me to life is participation. The more we stand off and look at it, the more we're going to miss it. We have to participate in it. And that wasn't easy for me. That was not easy for me to give up years of training, years of belief, years of success. Wasn't easy. And yet it was my only way. And I only, this past year or so, realized, it's still working, realized that one of the problems that I've had over the years with the church, well, one of my main problems, I wanted the church to be the church. Yeah. And I discovered the church had very little interest in that. And in fact, I could tell you some stories about that. One of them was here in Minnesota, so I told the Minnesota story. But we rented this retreat center that was run by the church. I think it was Presbyterian, so most of you are off the hook with this. And we got there, and they had a new director. And I had all these women coming from all over the country for a 9-day workshop arriving that day, and I arrived a little early so I could get things going. And he said, we'd raise our rates. And I said, fine, next year we'll pay the new rate. And he said, no, you have to pay it now. And I said, no, I don't. I have a written contract here. And our rates for this rate, and I've already told people, and I'm happy that we pay it next year. And he said, no, you have to pay it now. And I said, but I have a contract. You know what his response was? We're the church. You can either pay the new rate, or I'll turn you all away. Wow. Now that's not being the church. It's not being the church. And another experience I had of that was the Presbyterian church hired me to look at some. They were going to try to get to racism, sexism, all the isms by looking at the way they make decisions and see if the decision making in the church facilitated or interfered with dealing with all the isms. I don't know, this is, because they said if we try to hit this head on, it's not real popular. But if we go at it through decision making, this could be really good. And Northern and Southern Presbyterian were joining at that point. So they had an opportunity to develop a whole new polity if they wanted to. So it seemed like a good time. So we did a study. We studied different kind of groups, spotted groups that were, in different parts of the country, rural, city. Some had Native people, and some were integrated, and some were not in that center. And, we really did one of the best studies I've ever done. And it became very clear that Robert's Rules of Order is not exactly a good way to make decisions. There are always winners and losers. And groups knew it, and what most of the ones that were the most functional, we consider functional, told us, is that they made their decisions, all their decisions, by a consensus. And they kept working at the consensus until they got there. And those who couldn't agree, agreed to disagree, but to go along with, pretty good basic stuff. And then they told them that they'd taken the vote. What happened was, and they had said, if this study turns out to bear fruit, we will hire you to work with the entire church on changing our polity. We said, wow, that could really be exciting. And then when we gave our report, they said it was the best research they had ever seen. They really were. But they told us that they really couldn't hire us. And they really couldn't do that because it was too much for the church to change. It would be too... That's when I quit. That's when I quit working with the church. Because it would just seem like the institution was more important than the gospel. Well, I'll give you another one on those. This is in Hawaii. I really tried with the church. I used to go to the midnight service in Hawaii every Christmas Eve. And I loved them. I loved baby Jesus, and I loved the carols. And most of all, I loved that almost all of the choir and a lot of the people who went to that church were Hawaiian. And they do Christianity so differently from most places. And so I loved it. It was a love fest for me. It was a spiritual healing every time I went. And we had a new minister. I didn't know him, so I'd gone to one sermon and not been too happy, so I, sort of didn't see the need. And so he got up there, and he shamed people. He threatened them for burning in hell the rest of their lives if they didn't convert. And he did all these different things. Am I doing something wrong?
Not yet, but...
Okay.
No, Ann, I wanted to check with you and see if you needed time for Q&A, and should we let you know at any point that you would,
Yeah. Oh, how far am I into?
Well, you got plenty of time.
Oh, good. I got a lot
I was
more
going to
to
ask
say.
Pete to not interrupt you, but it didn't work out so well.
Oh, yeah. I'm codependent. Here comes the boss. What have I done now?
Q&A? You want to save some time for Q&A?
Yeah.
So I'll wave my arms in the back when you have, 15 minutes left?
Okay.
All right.
Okay, talk fast. Anyway, as luck would have it, number one, the conference minister in the United Church of Christ is sort of like the bishop, or the head guy, just happened to be an American Indian friend of mine. So first thing I did on Christmas Day was to call him and say, who in the hell is this guy? And what is he doing in our little Hawaiian church? And he said, yeah, he's sort of, really fundamentalist. And I said, how did you get him? You got to watch this guy. He said, he gives me a lot of trouble. And I said, well, this is terrible. This is terrible for the Hawaiians. They're so lovely, they're so tender, they're so on the right track. We need them. We need Hawaii much more than it needs us, by the way. We need those Hawaiians. And I said, this is terrible. And he said, so again, the creator and the sense of humor. The next day at the supermarket, I'm behind this guy. So I thought, okay, here we go. And I said, I was at your service the other night, you know, and he did the glad hand minister, you know, and I said, I'm praying for you. And he said, well, what? And I said, yes, I'm praying for you. I said, I feel so sad that you're a minister of the gospel and that you don't believe in the gospel. You don't believe in the good news. You don't believe that your job is to share the good news and let those who are ready to hear it, and those who aren't won't be. You don't trust the good news. I said, this must be awfully embarrassing for you, isn't it? So I will pray for you. He was not happy. I, on the other hand, was very happy. And I think he left very soon after that to go from what I would think batter the people in the South Pacific. So, you know, these are some of my experiences. And I'm a person who wanted to believe. I have a Baptist experience. First training group that I scheduled, more than twice the number of people I planned on signed up, so I had to find a new venue. The only place available was this Baptist retreat center. And so I called, and they said it was fine. They liked the business, and what kind of group were we? We were a group for healing, and that was okay, you know. So we arrived, and this was right after I took that time off and had spent a lot of time dealing with, sitting with Native elders all over the world and listening to whatever they wanted to share with me. And so, you know, I was in kind of an interesting place at that point. And so the first thing he did was, he said, "Are you a Christian?" I just thought, wow, what a question. What can I say that's honest? And I said, because I just been all over the world hearing what the church had done to Native cultures. Again and again and again and again and again. And I just felt like, am I a Christian? And I thought, I would have answered that yes all my life up until this point. And I said, you know, I'm going to have to get back to you. And I went off and prayed for a couple of days. Every break I had, I was up on the mountain praying. And I came back and I said, what I can say to you is that I have a personal relationship with Jesus. We get along really well. He's been misinterpreted a lot. He agrees, I agree. And we do quite well with each other, and we talk frequently. And that's what I can tell you. That man was terrified of me from that moment on. Every time he met me on a trail, he'd walk off into the woods. Rather than face me, he talked directly to Jesus and got along pretty well. And I just thought, what is wrong with all of this? What is wrong with all of this? And so the combination of getting into recovery and being serious about the 12-step work. I had trouble with 12-step work. I had trouble with everything. You know, I just don't buy shit very well. I just don't. And so with the 12-step work, I really had to, you know, work at it. And I took it seriously that the steps are there's an order into the steps for a reason. You know, for a reason there's an order to those steps. And so the first step was, I'm powerless over alcohol and my life has become unmanageable. Some of you may know that step. Well, I wasn't powerless over alcohol, but sure powerless over alcohol and others, you know. And I thought, that's the definition of an addiction, is that you're powerless over it. So, you know, but what I saw was I am powerless. Well, I don't know about that. Yeah. As a woman, I don't know that I'm willing to say that. Now, one of the things that I've noticed about myself is that my integrity is like a hound of heaven. So I was stuck on I am powerless for 2.5 years. I couldn't move on because I have been powerless in this culture enough. And I will not say I am powerless. I will not be powerless. I won't. And so I couldn't do that first part of that first step. And I had, to me, it was a matter of my personal deep integrity, not to pretend like I did it. I couldn't. And then I saw I'm powerless over alcohol, and I thought, yeah, well, that's kind of true. And now there's, you know, and I'm not going to call myself, but, you know, and I can admit I'm powerless over certain things, but I am not. My personal power is here. It's here, and it's never going to leave. I'm pretty sure of that. And so then, being Al-Anon, I had to deal with the second part. My life has become unmanageable. Never. Chaotic, painful, difficult, but not unmanageable. I'm handling it. I'm getting along with it. I'm dealing with it. No, so another 1.5 years on the second part. But when I got that done, I got the first step. My experience is there are very few people in AA or the 12-step program, and there are very few people, period, who really honestly get the first step. And I find this again and again when I work with people. No powerlessness. And that's really important to know, that powerlessness. So, you know, I've spent a lot of time now. I don't even know how long. I don't have a date that I gave myself when I went with my tablet to observe other people. When I started with the 12-step program, and I've been in it a long time. And this is one of the lapses that I see over and over again, that people have not honestly worked this 12-step step every day. Every day, because it has to be repeated every day, because we as human beings do not want to admit powerlessness. So all of this came together. I had, by the time I met these women of the group who were mostly alcoholic, and then had a housemate who was alcoholic who went to treatment, we all went to treatment. I had written Women's Reality. I had written Coherence. And it was here in Minnesota that I was speaking to a group of some place a little south of Minneapolis, St. Paul. And there were about 1,000 people there. And I saw these words come out of my mouth. The culture in which we live functions exactly like an active alcoholic. We live in an addictive society. And I was like, you know, I want to push them back in. And there was a silence like I've never heard. And then everybody was on their feet. And that's been really important for me to see that connection. Now, when I wrote Women's Reality, that was my feminist phase, which I'm still in. But what I described was 3 different systems. One was the what I call the reactive female system. And that system is a system of women who have adjusted to a society in which they are powerless and who have taken on the role and are living it. And the center of that system is the relationship with the husband, mostly, or other people. Then there is the white male system. The center of that system is the self-centeredness, and the work. And that's something every one of you has to watch out for. Everyone, all of us. And there was an emerging female system that I saw happening through feminism and through my Cherokee heritage and the Native people that I live with throughout the world. And in that system, the center of that system is relationships. My relationship with myself, my relationship with you, my relationship with my Creator, my relationship with my children, my relationship with the world. Everything is in relationships, and everything is in process. Nothing is static. Nothing. And part of the science, even, of the white male system is to make the world static to feed our illusion of control. So even the science that we have developed in Western culture is itself a science that supports addiction. Okay? So, well, where do I go from there? And that's when I wrote When Society Becomes an Addict and the Addictive Organization. And I must admit that the church was very present in my example of the addictive organization. And not just that. And so I began more and more to see the implications of the two. Then I moved from white male system to what I call the TMM system, the technological, mechanistic, materialistic system. Okay? Because it's white males carry the burden partially because we've let them. See, to me, one of the most important things, the first most important was being a participant. The second most important was staying on my own side of the street. One of my experiences that has been borne out, and I see it everywhere. I saw it in the, I don't know, probably most of it since I was sick in bed with diarrhea yesterday and a flu, I think. I was pooping all day. And so I didn't want to come down and leave a trail down here. So and I watched the most beautiful thing that's happened in this country in years. What happened in the Senate yesterday. It was really amazing. so that Terry talked about it. But what I saw was a shift there. And staying on your own side of the street. And you don't see that much at all. Anyway, with what we had, yeah, 5 minutes, I'll talk. Okay, I'm just gonna skip because I got a million things I want to say to you, Lauren. If there's something I really want to say to you, tell me. Now, this white male, or what I call the white male system, what I call
It's the opioid crisis and the biology of addiction as well. So yesterday I intimated that, and today we're going to go into some deeper dive. So raise your hand if you attempted to get the slides yesterday. Okay, and were you able to get the slides yesterday?
On my phone, not my computer.
On your phone, not your computer. All right.
And
On your phone. Okay.
I got to after I went to your website,
Okay.
got that,
Okay.
and then added the slash.
Okay, so you have to type it in. So you have to type in manojwala.com/addiction-and-faith-2. So raise your hand if you actually did download the slides yesterday. All right, so look around. Those are the people to ask about it. So there you go. So really looking forward to it. And here, again, I'm giving you a download of the slides. This is a PDF of the slides that you can have. So it is manojwala.com/addiction-and-faith-2. And if you remove the 2, you get the slides from yesterday. So,
Okay.
so addiction and faith, 2. All right, so let's dive right in. And like yesterday, I'm going to go through slides at a healthy clip, but that's so we can leave enough time at the end to have really a conversation and a dialogue about this, because I find that that's where sometimes the best stuff kind of comes out. But I want you to have an understanding of the basics, because I know it's a mixed audience in terms of your level of exposure or experience with addiction. So let's start with this. And this is the most recent year for which we have such information, 2015. But in 2015, 1 in 12 Americans needed substance use disorder treatment, meaning they had a substance use disorder that was severe enough that it wasn't reasonable to expect that would be manageable without some kind of professional help or support. All right. So I'm not talking about nicotine and caffeine. I'm talking about heroin, fentanyl, alcohol, substance use disorder. Right. 1 in 12 needed it, but only 1 in 10 of those actually received any form of treatment. So that means that fewer than 10%, basically, it turns out, received any type of substance use disorder treatment. And the challenge, of course, is what did that treatment look like? Well, for the majority of people, that looked like a visit or two or a detox admission. Right? Now, these are chronic diseases. So if this were diabetes, and we said, all right, are you getting treatment for your diabetes? And your answer was, I went to the emergency room once in the last year. Then you would have fell into this criteria because your blood sugar was too high, or I got admitted. But with addiction being a chronic disease, we treat it like an acute disease. So to follow the diabetes example out, it would be like I said to you then at the emergency room, go home, make sure that you eat well, find a source for insulin somewhere, figure out how to measure your blood sugar, learn about how to check your feed and do all the other stuff. At some point, try to get your kidneys squared away and your vision. And you may get numbness or tingling at some point. That means that your nerves are dying. Get that checked out too in the future. And that's constituted the sum total of your diabetes care. But that's really not how we address diabetes in the United States. In fact, there's been a wholesale shift in how we look at diabetes. We've actually completely transformed how we look at diabetes. There's diabetes prevention programs that have been developed by the CDC that are paid for, screening is paid for. You can have a registered dietitian paid for by your insurance company because they see the value, the economic value in educating you about that. You get follow-up visits, support, medications paid for, glucometers. It's still expensive. Don't get me wrong, diabetes is actually a very expensive illness to have. But people are living longer, blood sugars are coming down, end organ damage is getting better, and if you factor out what I alluded to yesterday, which is the weight of the nation and the way that we generally are, if you correct for that, we're getting much better at treating diabetes. We have more advanced medications for diabetes. We don't do that. If you look at hypertension, there was a barbershop model. Who has heard of the barbershop model for hypertension? That's right. Okay, so there you go. So we were deploying screening and treatment for hypertension in a place where the people who had the most likely to have hypertension were, in barbershops. And so we've done this, a culturally appropriate, targeted, mobile deployment of services, but we don't have that yet for addiction. So, but we need to get there. So when I say 1 in 10 received it, 1 in 10 received the equivalent of an ER visit maybe. But it's a much smaller number that actually got real care for addiction. So it builds on what we shared about yesterday, which is these disorders are basically the most undertreated disorders or conditions in the world. They're the most undertreated conditions in the world. So that's what I mean when I say the few who do receive treatment won't receive evidence-based history. So I have some friends and colleagues and coworkers who criticize my use of the word stigma. And I agree with their criticism. They say you shouldn't call it stigma. You should just call it, discrimination or injury. Because it's not just, when we stigmatize addiction, it's not just uncomfortable or hurtful or unfair, but it's directly harmful. In fact, there's research that shows that stigma is directly responsible for people not getting care. It's directly responsible for people not being able to pay for care. It actually affects the probability that a doctor will refer you to treatment. In fact, there were 2 great studies in Harvard settings which looked at the language that was used to describe people with addiction and asked psychiatrists and psychologists. These are experts, supposedly, on what they would do with a patient. And when they used the term substance use disorder in the record, the person was most likely to be referred to treatment. But when they used the term, addict or alcoholic, they were less likely to be referred to treatment. And this was actual physicians who were looking at the information. So language matters, stigma matters, and essentially our history is characterized by looking at addiction from a moral perspective, from the moral viewpoint. And it's easy to see why. Because if somebody is using alcohol or drugs, they appear to be making choices. It appears to be volitional. It appears that they're actually deciding what they're going to do. And it looks like that. We even use that in our term abuse, alcohol abuse, which is a terrible way of describing something. We don't call this, blood sugar abuse. We have to talk about these things in a way that removes the toxicity of that. But as I write about in the book, and as I'll talk to you about today, I think the fundamental question people often ask is addiction a disease, or is it a choice? Is it a disease, or is it a choice? I was talking with a gentleman earlier about either or, right? Things aren't that black and white. But here's the easiest way to answer that question: is addiction a disease or a choice? And that is, addiction is a disease of choice. It's a disease that actually affects the parts of your brain that are responsible for choosing, the parts of your brain that are responsible for taking in information, the parts of your brain that are responsible for synthesizing and analyzing that. Addiction affects your memory. You remember things differently. You take risks differently. There's parts of your brain involved in your risk-taking. So things we call, I don't like a lot of technical jargon, but things we call executive function, the way you plan, the way you think about how you're going to approach life, the way you perceive how others are treating you, the way you perceive your relationship with yourself and others. So addiction is a disease of choice. But it's easy to understand why we would view this morally, right? You can't really blame someone who views this morally, who doesn't have the information, because it really does appear to be a choice. And people who have addiction very much appear to be self-centered and bankrupt and evil, crazy, or stupid. That's how they look, right? And the rest of the world looks at it that way. But it is true that one person in addiction can ruin your whole, and it should say, week, month, or year. But it's very true. It's a very hard illness to live with. And I wasn't able to catch the earlier parts of the conference, but I know that Pastor Ed referred to the fact that people with addiction don't often regularly, per se, maybe attend religious services as regularly others, but their loved ones and their families do. And by the way, I think there's a lot of people who are attending as well, and he knows that too. But the point that he was making, which I really do agree with, is this idea that there's the afflicted, but then there's also the affected, those who are affected by this, and it's important for us to pay attention to that. So, what do people deserve? So I argue that people with addiction deserve social compassion and evidence-based care. That's what they deserve. By the way, this is what everybody deserves. Why should addiction be any different? We're offering it for diabetes and COPD and other conditions. We're starting to pay attention to that. We're starting to realize that when someone doesn't follow up for their diabetic care or doesn't test their blood sugars or eats in an unhealthy way, that we're all harmed by this. And so we all have a stake in wanting to help others with this. Everybody is harmed when one is harmed, right? We have a sense of that when it comes to other conditions. But we're missing it, and I don't mean the people in this room, but we as a society are missing it when it comes to addiction. Social compassion, evidence-based care. So, I told you yesterday we're going to get in the weeds a little bit here. I have an ambitious agenda. I'm going to cover these 8 things. The model of addiction, an updated neurobiology, meaning brain science, and the updated definition of addiction, the scope of the opioid epidemic. What does sensible prescribing look like? We've restricted prescribing of opioids. What happened when we did? I'm going to tell you about that. But here's the punchline in case you have to leave early. We have no right to help one set of patients while harming another set of patients. That's not allowable, so we have to fix this. What is medication-assisted treatment? The title today is "A Pill Alone Cannot Solve This." But that doesn't mean we abandon medications altogether. I mean, you know, when oral hypoglycemics, things like metformin and blood sugar medications were released on the world, released on America, no one was operating under the illusion that they would cure the diabetes epidemic. And they didn't. We use them, but we use lots of other things too. It's an all-hands-on-deck approach. What are the lessons that we can learn from other chronic diseases and how they have solved their crises so we can apply them to this crisis? What should solutions look like when they're end-to-end? And, of course, joy, hope, and recovery. So, all of this in an hour and some odd minutes. But, you know, you do all really have the slides, like for realsies, so please. So this is from the work of Petros Levunas, and it's not his research per se, but he's sort of synthesized it. He's a really sharp guy when it comes to the brain science. And the idea here is that you have, I have a pointer here, so you have biological, psychological, and social determinants that come together to flip a switch in your brain when you develop addiction, a one-way switch. So when you have it, doesn't go backwards. So this is the current thinking about this. That there's genetic risk factors, but there are, and remember I talked to you yesterday, there are probands for addiction. That means there's somebody who's the first, who has nobody else in their family who has addiction. With all these conditions, there's a proband, right? But you can have biological risk factors, certainly psychological risk factors, and that's huge now with the ACEs and trauma. And then you have social factors too. There are many social factors. And again, as I said yesterday, your zip code determines your health more than your diagnostic code. So there's social factors. Well, it flips the brain switch and it leads to addiction. So this is the current thinking about this. And what we had to add was intoxicant use a few years later, because what we found was that even if you had none of these risk factors, enough use of intoxicant can switch people in. So for example, there are people who can drink alcohol without any problems for long periods of time, even large amounts of alcohol without problems. And believe it or not, there are recreational crack cocaine smokers. It's not a common phenomenon, but it does exist. I've seen them. Years ago, I helped an OBGYN who was a recreational crack smoker. Seems very unusual, right? But he did not appear to be experiencing the consequences. Of course, he came to the awareness later that, in fact, it wasn't so recreational. But in any case, there are intoxicants that are more likely to produce, to flip that switch in your brain. And that the probability of that switch flipping has to do with a lot of factors, that are on the screen, but also the intoxicant itself. Is it oral, and so it goes in your mouth and it gets processed by your liver, or do you inject it right into your bloodstream, or do you stick it right into your cerebrospinal fluid, like an intrathecal pump or something like that, where the medicine actually goes in there. And then there's also relapse. And the factors that affect relapse are stress, triggers, and exposure to the intoxicant itself. And this is why people with alcohol use disorders will tell you, I can't have any alcohol at all. Which means, and they should be very serious about this, because it's the same as a risk factor for any other serious illness. If you have an alcohol use disorder, a severe alcohol use disorder, and there were a water cooler here, 5-gallon jug of water, and I just put a shot of liquor in that water cooler, that person probably should not drink off the water cooler, even though it's just one shot of liquor in the water cooler, because the risk is just not worth it. You don't know what will happen. And a lot of this has to do with, you don't know what you don't know. Yesterday I talked about the social determinants of health. These are the factors that come together that influence the probability that you will become ill, that you will develop one of these conditions and become ill. And here are some of them now. Depression and anxiety, human suffering, financial problems, functional disability, means you can't do things in your life that are important to you, family and social problems. Now, we didn't get a chance to talk a lot about this, but obviously addiction is a family disease, and I assume that everybody here knows that it affects the family and that it's driven in part by the dysfunction is not just the dysfunction of the person, but the whole system. Sleep disturbances play a huge role. Cognitive disturbances, how you think, and then you can have secondary physical problems. And these are the determinants not only of addiction, but also of chronic pain. They're the same determinants. Your risk of developing chronic pain is higher if you have these things that are in the satellites here. So there's a big interaction between chronic pain and addiction, and we'll talk more about that. So those are the determinants of illness. Yesterday someone asked, well, what about the determinants of health? Are there ways of understanding what determines wellness and health and well-being? And this is from an Australian framework, but I liked it. And it was social inclusion, economic participation, and freedom from discrimination and violence. And so it's supportive relationships, involvement in your community, and civic activities. It's work, education, it's housing, it's having the finances you need to be able to navigate through the world. And then freedom from fear, freedom from living in terror, physical security, am I safe? Valuing diversity, self-determination, and being able to participate in the direction of your own life rather than having that dictated to you. So these are some of the determinants of mental health. So an interesting fact about things that are intoxicants, things that get you high, things that you can develop an addiction to, is that they all mimic or activate something that's already in your brain. They all mimic or activate something that's already in your brain. And that was true for everything when I was in medical school except marijuana, because we had not yet found at that time an endogenous, meaning in your body chemical that was similar to marijuana, and we had not yet identified marijuana receptors when I was in med school. But we did then after that, and so now it's true for all of them. So alcohol affects GABA and glutamate. These are neurotransmitters. So raise your hand if you know what a neurotransmitter is, in case everybody knows what that is. Amphetamines and cocaine affect dopamine, benzodiazepines and GHB, GABA, cannabis, endocannabinoids, which is actually something that's in your body already. It's a cannabis-like substance that's in your body. Hallucinogens and MDMA, serotonin, nicotine, acetylcholine, opiates, endorphins, and PCP and ketamine affect glutamate. But even though they affect these chemicals, all the paths flow like tributaries into a central river, and that river is your dopamine function. So they may affect a lot of other chemicals, but the tributaries flow into the dopamine reward pathway, like tributaries into a river. That's how they work in the brain. So, and that part of the brain that's involved in dopamine is your nucleus accumbens, and it's the ventral tegmental area, the nucleus accumbens, and this is judgment, the prefrontal cortex. So the point is that you have different functions in different parts of your brain, but this is really your reward pathway of your brain here, deep in your nucleus accumbens. And if you look at the dopamine inside your nucleus accumbens, you can learn a lot about how addictive or reinforcing a substance is. And one way of doing that is to actually measure it. Measure what happens to the dopamine in your brain if you have a really nice meal, like we had this morning, or sex, which I'll make no comment about. Well, it turns out that sex is about twice as good as food. Unless you're in When Harry Met Sally and you had that meal. Then maybe you've got, the more the spike over here. So, but that's the issue, is that really it spikes this. And if you look at it, it spikes and comes back down, and it spikes and comes back down. And by the way, this come back down is part of the reason why we think that many people will crave a cigarette after sex, for example, because they want to keep that level high. Is what happens. And so what happens with nicotine then is a spike as well, but then kind of a plateau here that's still higher than normal. You get a plateau for a few hours, actually. With morphine, it's more gradual. Cocaine and ethanol, these are at the 200, 250, but sex is, and cocaine's more in the kind of the sex level of raising of the. So that's what happens immediately when you use an intoxicant. But this would happen if you gave my grandmother cocaine, who never had addiction. This would happen if you gave anyone who doesn't have addiction. It would spike their dopamine. So this is not addiction. And this is an important point, which is the effect of substances in the body is not addiction. The issue is what happens afterwards. What happens when you're not using? That's really when your blood alcohol is 0, when your urine drug screen is 0, when everything is clean, to use that terminology, which I don't actually like, and everything is negative, you do the most puzzling thing you could possibly do. In the context of a job that's almost gone, or relationships, or family, and a devastated life, you pick up that first drink or drug again. And that puzzling act is done when the brain has no intoxicants in it. It's done when the brain is, quote unquote, normal, but it isn't. Or it isn't. How do we know that? Well, if you take functional images of a normal brain, I've never met one, but I'm told they exist. You find a lot of activation here. And then if you look at someone who was a cocaine, this is a slide taken from NIDA, and I don't like this terminology, but if you take somebody who used cocaine, had cocaine dependence, and has been basically off of cocaine for 10 days, you see this kind of activation. And then more than 3 months later, 3 months of sobriety and abstinence, it doesn't take a neuroradiologist to see that that ain't that.
Right.
So, and there's a lot of additional studies, I'm just giving you a summary, but the point is that if you ask this brain to make choices and decisions and to navigate life with the same rules that this brain is used to operating, you're going to make a mistake. You're going to have problems. And this is why, there are many approaches to solving for this. People create systems of care, sober houses, halfway. There's all kinds of supportive interventions that are available in 12-step programs. They have a mechanism for surrogate decision-making called sponsorship. And a sponsor is essentially a form of a surrogate decision-maker intended to bridge the gap between here and here, essentially. And that's critically important. So what do we know about updated models of addiction? So this is that stuff I shared with you, that's 10, 15, 20 years old, right? Now we have new ways of thinking about it. We have the theory of motivation and localizing it to a part of your brain that's kind of behind and just above your eyeballs. And then we have not only reward pathways, but we have anti-reward pathways. And this has to do with the cognitive biases. And cognitive biases are ways that your brain tricks you into making the wrong decisions with the information that's in front of you. And there are lots of ways that this happens. In fact, I was talking to a gentleman beforehand. Either or is one cognitive bias. We can affect the way that you recall things. I talk a lot about these in the book. There's one interesting bias that was discovered several years ago called the illusion of asymmetric insight. And there are hundreds of these biases that trick your brain. But the illusion of asymmetric insight goes like this. I believe that I could chat with you for a little while and get a sense of who you are, understand your motivations, your desires, etc. I believe that if I talked to you, I could acquire that about you. However, I am deep and complex and could not be knowable by you in such a short period of time. That's the illusion of asymmetric insight. And there are many, many other such cognitive biases that exist that cause you to take information, and they affect everybody, right? They affect everybody. They affect the way we look at politics. There's confirmation bias, there's hindsight bias, there's hundreds of biases. And the reason we have these biases is so we can survive, because our brain is more like a processor and less like a hard drive. In other words, our brain has been evolved or built, whatever your belief is about that, but our brain essentially exists to process information quickly rather than accurately. It's more like a processor, less like a hard drive, which means you'll trade accuracy for speed. And it uses these techniques, these biases, which bias suggests it's negative, but actually they confer advantage to us in the world to be able to make these decisions quickly. You make assumptions about it. You don't have to think about how to brush each individual tooth. Your hand just does it after a while, right? If you had to think about that, you'd never get to all the teeth. You did it as a 5-year-old or as a 4-year-old, but now it must be automatic or you won't make it to work on time. And so they exist. They're adaptive in a way. But these biases exist, and there's also some anti-reward pathways. And then there's this newer sense of what we call interoception. It's a fancy word for saying you take all this information in from your senses and from your environment, and how do you develop meaning out of that? And so there's a brain science of that as well. So just memorize this slide. And I can go home. I leave this to you to walk through, but essentially this talks about interoception and the anti-reward pathways. And this is the current thinking, which I'll spare you, but this is the current thinking about the stop-go model of how we think about addiction in the brain. So it's not just dopamine, but it's the interplay of a lot of things. So I show this to you partly tongue-in-cheek, but partly to say we have evolved our thinking beyond simply just dopamine, but all the drivers and things that lead to that. And we as scientists, as neuroscientists, as doctors, we appreciate that overly reductionistic views of this are not helpful. There is a deeper layer of complexity, but we won't go too much into it today. How should we define addiction? Right? How should we define addiction? This has evolved over time. But in April 2011, we finally introduced spirituality into ASAM, American Society of Addiction Medicine's definition of addiction. And I'll read it. I don't like to read the slide too much, but addiction is a primary, okay? And why is it primary? It's primary because we don't think of addiction as secondary. In other words, a lot of people will say, well, he was just self-medicating his depression, or she was just self-medicating her trauma. And that may be true, right? But once you develop addiction, even if you treat the depression, even if you treat the PTSD, the addiction still remains. So it's a primary condition. It's a chronic disease. I explained why it was chronic. It's not acute. It's not like fracturing your elbow, where the ER might actually be able to solve this once and for all for you. But it's more of a chronic. It's a disease, and it's a brain reward. We talked about that. Motivation, memory, and all the related circuitry, which was on the last slide. Dysfunction in these circuits leads to characteristic biological, psychological, social, and, as someone over on this side of the room yesterday mentioned, spiritual manifestations. This is reflected in the person in a sick way pursuing reward and relief. And this is important because it's much more about relief. In fact, if you look at people with addiction, they are much more running away from something than they are running towards something. They don't necessarily want to get high, they just want relief. And that's what happens. And in fact, the joy that came from the early use of intoxicants is gone after time, and then it becomes just relief. So it's hard to memorize all that, so some people think about the ABCDEs of addiction. Inability to consistently abstain, impairment in the control of your behavior, craving, this is good news for a guy who wrote a book on cravings, diminished recognition of significant problems with one's behaviors and relationships, which is critical, and then dysfunctional emotional response. This is the ABCDEs of addiction. All right, so that's your background. Now let's talk about the opioid epidemic. Now in 2015, you had almost 90,000 people die from alcohol use disorders. So even though opioids are killing a lot more people now, the latest data, as in from last month, suggests that in 2017 we had about 70,000 from all drugs combined. All drugs combined. You still have alcohol killing many, many more people than drugs. Alcohol is the #1 killer, no question. And why don't we pay attention to alcohol? Because it's not killing the right people. That's the reason. So, sorry, but that's the reason why. That's the reason why. And you know, I've appeared. I don't say this in any kind of self-promoting way. I'll never be as famous as Ed, but I've appeared on all the major networks. And it's always about opioids. It's never about alcohol. So that's always when the invitation comes. So, but almost every time I try to mention this. So, excess drinking is responsible for 10% of the workers who die. Just think about that. 10%. Staggering. By comparison, opioid overdoses led to 33,000 deaths in 2015. The number's slightly higher now, and about 1 in 5 opioid overdoses involves alcohol anyway. So it's like you've got a lot of overlap there. And the alcohol deaths are also trending upwards, and the intersection is many, many decades away. So alcohol is the real killer here, but we're not paying attention to it. And we go after intoxicants like opioids periodically in cycles throughout history. We go after these things. In fact, the war on drugs, you could argue, in the United States is 104 years old, if you go back to Harrison Narcotic Act of 1914. What do we have to show for it? Right? What do we have to show for it? And we go through these cycles. And in fact, if you look at benzodiazepines, people know what benzodiazepines are, like Xanax and Valium and stuff like that. So those are now at the level that opioids were 15 years ago, and rising at the same rate that opioids were rising 15 years ago. So that'll be the next one. The problem is we don't go after the underlying causes. We don't address the causes. So this is the issue. And probably most of you have seen graphs like this before. Raise your hand if you've seen this graph or some version of this graph. Oh, okay, about a third of the audience, not everybody. Well, this is intended to show the opioid overdose deaths, and you can see that, you've got your totals is the blue bars, so we'll just follow those rather than male or female. And you can just see it went from 10, 12,000 to 33,000. So it's a very dramatic increase in deaths from opioids. And I apologize for the busyness of this slide, and it's not actually that important because you guys have drawn an audience from all over the country. So I was going to circle Minnesota for you because I thought, Ed, that you were going to have a more provincial conference. I didn't realize you were going to have such a massive draw from all over the place, but wherever you're from, you can look this up. You can see Minnesota here, but these are the deaths per 100,000, and the bar indicates how far you've traveled. So, for example, New Hampshire's gone from this rate all the way up to this rate. New Hampshire has a huge problem when it comes to opioids. So the length of the bar. So this is where you start. The white circle's where you started, and the blue circle's where you got to in 2015. Right, exactly. What you find here is that basically nobody's getting any better, generally speaking. Yeah, and you find your state, which tells you two things. One, you're really good at sorting through a list that's not alphabetical. Two, you must have amazing vision. But you can look at it on your own. So. I was better than Minnesota. Yeah. Okay, so good. So you got a little rivalry there. So here you have, and here you have similarly trended by intoxicants. So here you see heroin has had a really steep kind of increase here. Methadone, and then you've got this. That shouldn't be methadone. Yeah, that's methadone use. Okay, this is methadone, and then. You've got the synthetics that really are just going on a steep trajectory. And if you go to 2017, they've actually surpassed heroin. So synthetics are the highest. And you see the benzodiazepines are climbing too very quickly, as I warned you about. So a few years from now, when you start hearing about benzos in the news, you can say, Omar told me so. That's a sad thing, but it's true. And no, it's not getting better. So this is the 2017 preliminary. And the preliminary, by the way, is now more baked. This was very preliminary when it was first released, which is when I made the slide a few months ago, but just in the last couple of weeks, they've released more updated data. So these are pretty baked figures. But bottom line is, nothing's getting better here, basically. Nothing's getting better. And now, 2 out of every 3 overdose deaths. I told you there's about 70,000 overdose deaths a year. So 2 out of every 3 overdose deaths now involve opioids. If people are, can you hold it till the, yeah. There was a question, and I'm told we're gonna have time for questions at the end, so. And I'm sorry about this, but I'll just read the highlighted part here. This is a paper that came out a few years ago. Basically, adults with mental health conditions receive 51.4% of the total opioid prescriptions distributed in the United States each year. This is a very, very big study that was released. And I'll give it to you in more of a graphical format here. Half of the opioids prescribed in the United States are going to people with mental illness. So if you think you're going to solve the opioid crisis by turning off the spigot, that's very naive. You're not addressing the driver, the fundamental driver underneath this. Depression, anxiety, trauma, all the other factors that are going on underneath the use of opioids. And that's 16%. 16% of Americans at any given time have mental illness, basically, some form of behavioral health condition. So basically, you've got half the opioids that are being prescribed going to 16% of the population, and those are the ones that have mental health conditions. The majority of people with mental health conditions are not receiving treatment. It's not as bad as with addiction, but it is still less than half. So, bottom line is, we will not get our handle on this crisis until we actually address this. This is another, ignore all this, just focus on the headline. I give you this so you can review at your leisure. And the punchline is, over a median follow-up of 300 days, it's about 9 months, opioids were dispensed to 91% of patients after an overdose. That means if you had an overdose on opioids, your probability, so you have an overdose, you went to the emergency room, you survived, okay, you survived an opioid overdose, which is like not an easy thing to do, because many, many people die. 9 out of 10 of you who are in that boat will receive another prescription for opioids in 9 months. In 9 months. And 1 in 5 of you will overdose again in the next couple years. We're not integrating this. So here's day 1. This is your non-fatal opioid overdose. Your Jane, your Johnny, your Tina. Day 300, you've already had opioids dispensed again. And 1 in 5 of you will overdose again. Many of those will die. So, I've told you that you've got to, you can't solve this problem by controlling prescribing. But you have to have some sensible prescribing. You can't just give away opioids like candy, right? That's where we're stuck. What do? Many people develop these conditions after receiving a prescription opioid. So you have to both solve that problem and also realize that that alone is not going to solve the problem. It's okay, most of the major problems we face in the world are complicated. They're not simple. So this is another one that's complicated and not simple. I was talking to a young lady who's from Ohio and promised I would share some information about lessons learned from the Ohio experiment. So here it is. In many cases, decreasing prescribing has had some impact on decreasing overdoses. There are places where that's true, but in other cases it hasn't. And Ohio is a great example here. Ohio did a fantastic job reducing opioid prescribing. It got the doctors together, got everybody put the systems in place, and it really reduced the number of prescriptions. They had a growing opioid-addicted population, they recognized it. They started to shut down pill mills. Raise your hand if you know what a pill mill is. Everybody knows what a pill mill is. You had added scrutiny on your prescribing. If you wrote a prescription, the pharmacist could call you. The hospital system would say, hey, you need to prescribe this much, etc. If you had more, you got on a list as a doctor. Then they paid closer attention to you. Maybe the medical board got interested at that point. They started to introduce tamper-resistant and long-acting opioid formulations, which, by the way, do almost nothing, but they did it. And what happened was the law of supply and demand. And there was an increasing supply of heroin, which results in a decreasing cost of heroin. It's the cheapest high in Ohio. And then increasing, when you do something over and over again, you get better at it, so increasing purity of heroin. And you ended up with the chart I showed you earlier, which is even more overdose deaths, right? So you restricted prescribing, more people died. Didn't work, right? Didn't work for everybody. Worked for some people. So you have to get smart about the answers. And we're going to talk about what getting smart about prescribing looks like. Now, I like, who's heard of the CDC guidelines for opioids? Okay, most of you have heard about this. So like the CDC came out with guidelines that said, hey, not don't prescribe or yes prescribe, but ask these questions, look at these factors, take a look at this, and be careful about how you do this. But unfortunately, systems aren't good at hearing that. when systems hear that, they don't hear gray, they hear black and white. Oh, don't prescribe as much opioids. We're going to measure how much opioids our doctors are prescribing. It should go down by X%. And so it created problems there. The Canadians have done a better job of looking at how we should be prescribing. And they came up with these 9 recommendations. And I know it's a little wonkish, but I'm going to walk through each of them because I think they're really good. And the first is, when considering therapy for people who have chronic pain, non-cancer pain, chronic pain, we recommend to try to optimize the non-opioid medications and to use non-medication-based approaches for chronic pain. And that's the first, should be the first step. Recommendation 2, for people with chronic pain who do not have a substance use disorder or another psychiatric condition, because it turns out that depression and anxiety and trauma increase your risk of developing addiction if you're prescribed opioids. So if you don't have that, but if you have problematic pain that persists, you can try a trial of opioids. Trial of opioids for those people. For people with chronic pain who have an active substance use disorder, do not prescribe opioids. Now, some folks who were from hospice earlier asked me, well, what about hospice? And in those scenarios, it's of course completely appropriate to prescribe opiates, and they do in their setting, but they have some folks who are in recovery and themselves ask the question, should I take opioids if I'm dying? And my answer is, you should take opioids. But everybody gets to make their own decision about how they choose to do that. And for people who have chronic pain with an active psychiatric disorder whose non-opioid therapy has been optimized but still have pain, stabilize the psychiatric disorder first before you try to use any kind of opioids. So always recognize when you have somebody who has chronic pain and a behavioral health condition that's not stabilized, you've got to stabilize that first because the opioids will actually make things worse. So you have to, so if you care about somebody's pain, you have to stabilize their behavioral health condition first because that's the best way to address their pain. Number 5, for chronic pain with a history of substance use disorder, when the non-opioids have been optimized and they have persistent pain, again, don't try opioids. Add additional non-opioid types of therapies for that person. For people with chronic pain who are beginning long-term therapy, restrict the dose to less than 90 milligrams of morphine equivalents, rather than having no upper limit. And this is a very rational approach because the overdose rate really skyrockets above 90 and especially above 120. So it's dangerous to receive very, very high opioid doses like that. People with chronic pain, non-cancer who are beginning opioid therapy, at the beginning, so if you're beginning opioid therapy, keep the dose below 50 morphine equivalents per day. So 90 for chronic and 50 if you're just beginning it. And then there's a couple more here. For people with chronic pain who are using more than 90, taper to the lowest effective dose rather than making no change. So some people should attempt a taper down. This should be collaborative with the person who's, hey, we're cutting your opioids, but to reduce the risk of overdose death. And if you're having challenges in tapering them off, then you should use a multidisciplinary approach. Problem is we don't have many such approaches, but you should use such an approach. So that's the recommendation. And it talks about here what a multidisciplinary pain approach should look like. I'll let you review that on your own. All right, so we have an ambitious agenda, so I'm going to move on to the next topic, which is medication-assisted treatment. Who has heard of buprenorphine or Suboxone? Okay, everybody has. All right. So for those who haven't heard of it or raised their hand because they didn't want to be seen as someone who didn't know what this meant, what it is that if you have an opioid use disorder and you want to reduce the risk of death, you can take a medication called buprenorphine, which partially activates your opioid receptors. So you don't get high per se in the majority of cases. You just diminish your cravings. But it is like a partial opioid agonist. And what it does is it reduces your risk of relapse. It improves the probability that you will be employed. It improves the possibility that you'll keep your family together, that you'll stay out of prison. And it reduces the risk of this highly undesirable side effect of opioids, death. So an important point is that treatment itself in addiction is effective. It's about as effective as treatment for type 1 diabetes, high blood pressure, or asthma. So it is effective. The problem is the majority of people don't receive it. And the other part of this slide to realize is that many people don't respond to treatment for any chronic condition. This is the nature of medicine. Right? I think we have a kind of a perch in history where we assume that medicine should be able to solve all problems, but we can't. People die. They're very complicated illnesses. We don't know how to fix everything. And that's important. However, the Cochrane Library, raise your hand if you've heard of the Cochrane before. maybe a few people have, okay. This is like a nice repository of evidence-based practices. These are people that go and study all the studies. They take all, you know, 1 week you read a study that says red wine's good for your heart health, and the next week that says it's not. By the way, it's not. But the point is, these are people that go through and really look at all the studies very, very carefully and say, here's the takeaway on each of the major topics. Whenever I want to know something but don't have the time to read every single study, I go to the Cochrane because they know, and they synthesize this stuff. But buprenorphine maintenance, buprenorphine is Suboxone, that's that medication I told you about, versus placebo and versus methadone maintenance for opioid dependence. That's what they studied. And this is what they found. They reviewed 31 trials. 31 is a large number of studies. That's a very large number of studies. And they basically concluded there's high quality of evidence that buprenorphine is superior to placebo in keeping people in treatment. And we separately know that keeping people in treatment improves their probability of staying alive. So that's a separate fact we know in the world of addiction treatment. And it's an effective medication in the maintenance of heroin dependence. It retains people in treatment at basically at any dose and suppresses illicit opioid uses in placebo-controlled trials. So it is an effective treatment. It's not perfect, and we'll talk about why it's not perfect. So when you think about treatment, you think about detox, maybe you think about medications, 12-step meetings, you think about outpatient treatment, maybe inpatient treatment, partial, residential. This is what we think of when we think about addiction treatment, right? That's what we think of. But that's not really addiction treatment. Addiction treatment is all this other stuff. It's vocational services, mental health services, pastoral, it's legal services, medical, educational, HIV/AIDS. It's a nexus of things that wrap around the person. And the best treatment really builds a system of care around the individual. So what can we learn from other chronic diseases? Insulin didn't solve the diabetes epidemic, and neither did these newer medications for diabetes that cost thousands of dollars. Nothing is solving this, right? No pill is solving the diabetes epidemic. That doesn't mean we don't give it to you. And remember that diabetes still kills more Americans than breast cancer and AIDS combined. It's hard to know this because the way we consume media and information and the way information is shared in America, the big drivers we don't really know. Like everybody knows that a pink ribbon means breast cancer, right? But how many of you knew that alcohol is one of the top 3 leading causes of breast cancer, right? So the point is that it is one of the top 3 causes of breast cancer, right? If you're a woman, your risk of breast cancer goes up with each drink that you drink. So the point is that there are lots of such information about the drivers of this, and there's actually an interesting history if you Google this about how the alcohol industry has supported breast cancer efforts, and you could say he who pays the piper calls the tune, perhaps, and that there's been an effort to kind of downplay the role of alcohol in driving outcomes for breast cancer, but alcohol is a major risk factor for, it's basically the highest or second highest modifiable risk factor for breast cancer. You can't control genetics, obviously. As an added burden, behavioral health conditions have the same challenges that diabetes and COPD have, but they also impair your relationships, impair your trust, impair your mood. Activation is a technical word we use to describe how involved in your care you are, how involved in your health care you are. Hope and self-efficacy, and stigma and shame play a huge role. Now there is stigma and shame, and those things exist in COPD and in other conditions too, but not so much as we have here. And if we don't apply standard chronic disease approaches to addiction. I wish we did. But even if we did, it wouldn't be enough because they don't really address the drivers of engagement. So if you were to give everybody treatment for free and just completely open up and pay for all health care, you would have a lot more use of health care. But you would still have the majority of people with addiction and behavioral health conditions not getting help. And there have been many experiments of that. There was something, did I talk to you about the dental mental problem yesterday? So you know about the dental mental problem. So the idea is, this is not Field of Dreams. It's not like build it and they will come. We have to solve for the drivers of engagement, why people avoid care, the fear that's involved, the anxiety, the complex, the friction between people and their healthcare system have to be solved. So what should the solutions look like? All right. I'm going to talk to you about what care for addiction really should look like in an ideal world. in one slide or less, if that's possible. We need to use analytics, and we talked about analytics yesterday, but we need to use analytics to identify people for whom treatments will work and match those treatments. So if you walk into one treatment center, I won't name names, or another treatment center, you may get two wildly different things if you have one background or another background. But if you have breast cancer, or if you have some type of rare cancer, we can fingerprint the treatment exactly to you, and we're getting even better at that. Every single person who gets care and gets well, and by the way, every person who doesn't get well helps everyone else. Everyone is helped because we share the information. And we found a way to share the information without being too worried about our privacy, because we found ways to strip out the identifying information and show that. We're getting better at that. But we're stuck when it comes to addiction because we've hardwired into our code that we're not going to do that. And we thought we were going to fix that this year with the new opioid bill that came out last week. Raise your hand if you heard about that. Right, so it's a big bill that kind of came around. And it was going to be introduced. There was going to be legislation introduced to get rid of this 42 CFR Part 2 restriction. It's a law. It's a federal law that says you can't share addiction information like you can other healthcare information. It's a law that says treat addiction differently than other conditions. And we thought it was going to be introduced, but there's a lot of politics behind it, and it did not get introduced. So there's some people who unfortunately believe that this law is protecting their privacy, but it's not protecting your privacy. Not only is it not protecting your privacy, but it's harming those who have addiction, sadly. Not everybody wants treatment at any given moment. So you think about someone who has alcohol use disorder, and you say, hey, do you want help for this problem? And the response is, what problem? You have the problem, I don't have the problem. Right? And to be fair, you may have a problem. Right? So that's fair too. Put that all in context yourself. But the point is, people don't always want help. And so we tend to think, then we draw from that conclusion, people with alcoholism don't want help. That's the conclusion we draw. People with addiction don't want help. But it's actually not true. And if you measure perceived need for treatment, which is whether a person actually wants help or not, it fluctuates throughout the course of the year. Now, when you hear people in recovery, they'll say, I didn't want help, but that's actually hindsight bias or recall bias. If you measure people, it turns out that at various points they do want help during the year. They may not remember that. It could be on a Monday morning, it could be on a Sunday, it could be why they're watching religious programming on it, it could be anything, right? So, but there are moments where people want help. There are these moments. Maybe your wife kicked you out, maybe your kid was disgusted by it, maybe it could be any number of things, right? But there are these moments that happen throughout the course of addiction, not just late, where people have an increased perceived need for treatment. The problem is that at that moment, it's impossible to strike when the iron's hot. Because how do you get care? You have to flip over your card, call somebody, find out where to go, blah, blah, blah. Maybe they have a wait list. There's all kinds of problems with I call that the friction. That's the friction between the person who... So we have to make treatment the path of least resistance. Right. So treatment should be the path of least resistance rather than the result of most coercion. That's how we're going to solve this, right? So, so we have to make it easier to do that. And that means having relationships in place with people so that when that moment strikes, it's available. Imagine a world in which if you had any desire whatsoever for addiction treatment, you could push a button as quick as on your phone or anything else and get the help you need right there. It could start in the palm of your hand. And I do a separate thing on that, but talk on kind of what the future might look like. But that's one area. Trust-based frameworks to engage people over time, right? I want you all to leave here thinking we do need to do a better job paying for care, but paying for care will not solve the fundamental engagement problem. In any environment where you offer care for free, the majority of people still don't get help. There is an engagement problem, all right? Evidence-based interventions, obviously we need that. Strengths-based coaching and support in between sessions. So right now, addiction care is delivered in discrete units. Go to this session, go to this inpatient treatment center, go to this detox. And in between, you're sort of on your own. Or you're offered some things that you should, quote unquote, do. How many people do the things they should do? I don't do the things I should do. Like, who wears sunscreen every day? I mean, don't raise your hand, but. There's a lot of things you should do you don't do. And that's for us, and it's really hard if you have these problems. So, I'm pretty good with my sunscreen, but not great. So, so anyway, So you need to have that support in between. So it should not be discrete, it should be continuous. Not discrete, continuous. And then we need to use artificial intelligence and predictive learning. Now imagine a world in which you're 42, you live in such and such zip code, you have this family history, you have these genetics, you've tried these treatments before, you have these other conditions, this is your ACE score, these are your other medical conditions, based on that fingerprinting, we've determined that here are the 5 things that would most likely reduce your risk of relapse. Go to X number of meetings, depending on your theoretical framework orientation, call this number of people per day, do these following activities related to exercise, diet. We could actually write a prescription for you based on the data. And let's say they didn't work for you. Well, that would help the next person, because we would ingest that data and understand the analytics of that, but we don't have that today. Okay, I'm going to open up for questions after I finish with this, this concept of joy, hope, and recovery. Oh, and I might have something after joy, hope, and recovery. I think I have something after joy, hope, and recovery. So let's talk about joy, hope, and recovery. So this is I got this from Covington et al., but by way of a guy named Mike Miller, who's really a great addiction guy. And this is like the best single slide description of addiction recovery I've ever seen in my life. So I was like, I have to steal this because this is amazing to me. To me, this captures the whole thing in one slide, which is addiction is a restriction and constriction and the spiraling down of your entire world. Your relationships get smaller, your affects get smaller, your social life, everything gets smaller and tighter and restricted and out of your control. And recovery is really about expansion. So a lot of people think recovery is about not using drugs. And of course that's if you have addiction, you shouldn't use drugs, okay? I told you. If nobody told you, I told you. Don't use drugs. But that doesn't work, right? That doesn't work. It's an expansion of your world. It's an yesterday someone asked about community. It's an expansion of your community, your network, your relationships, your worldview. Things get bigger in recovery. Things get big. A lot of people, when they enter into recovery, they think, "Oh, this is the end of my life. This is the end of my ability to have fun." And those who are in long-term recovery, sometimes they chuckle, right? Because it's like, no, this is the beginning, right? This is finally you can, and it's not really about recovery, because many people say that, uh-oh, I'm running low on battery here. So it seems that I may not be properly plugged in. So is that outlet not working? Is there someone who could maybe check that? And so ultimately, the actions you take to produce recovery will become as desirable to you as the thing you originally craved. I don't like to quote myself, but that's from my book. All right, so here's fun takeaways, and these are the sort of the key takeaways. Prescriptions are a fraction of the problem. Most of the disease shifts to illicit pills or heroin. Restricting alone pills won't work. Many people with addiction have depression or anxiety. If you ignore that, you're going to fail. Alcohol is far more lethal than opioids and a much bigger problem, and a much more costly problem too, by the way. We didn't talk about cost today. Sensible prescribing is a good and important goal, but it falls short of what we really need to do. Right? Can't just turn on the spigot. Access to care is not enough. You can't just give people access to care. You have to solve for the drivers of engagement. Solve for the drivers of engagement. These conditions are chronic conditions. An 8-week intervention is not going to be enough for this. This is a lifelong type thing. And we really do have to give people access to medication-assisted treatment. Buprenorphine reduces the risk you'll die. That doesn't mean everybody should be on it, but everybody should have the right to make their decisions about what treatments they want, just like they do with diabetes or anything else. We do not need to be in the business of determining what people want. And I'll just tell you this briefly, which is, when Zantac, who knows what Zantac is? Everybody knows what Zantac is. When Zantac was going to go over the counter, the gastroenterologists were in an uproar. They thought they were going to go out of business. So much of their business was around prescribing these H2 blockers. Their business got better. It turns out we can trust people to make decisions about their lives if we empower them with the tools to do so. So it's a crazy, I know, what a crazy concept. Find out what people want and give it to them. Unbelievable. So I have, I'm not going to talk about it today, for each of these bullet points on this slide, I have a paragraph that explains to you exactly what I just said. So you can review each of these paragraphs in detail so you don't have to remember it, like build trust engagement, stick with people. Stick with people. A tiny fraction of people get help, and most of those get short-term help. It's a chronic condition. We would never treat someone with heart failure just for 8 weeks and send them out the door. That's just not right. Use only proven treatments. Okay, that was my last slide, and I ran out of power. So I'm powerless, as they say. Thank you. He says he purpose because I was going long, so sorry. Okay,
All right.
are we doing microphones here?
We are, and we've got about a little under half an hour for Q&A, should we
Oh, good.
desire it. So,
Good.
I will, just get your hands up, keep them up, and I will find you.
I've done a few funerals for young men who have died of synthetic meds that they get over the internet, dark web. Is that, and the question that families have asked, are people intentionally making these synthetics to kill people?
Right.
Because there's, maybe there is that little bit of fentanyl or carfentanil in it, but could you just help me understand a little more about that dark web? And
Right.
I know it's a big question, but
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, it's very natural to say, you find out what killed somebody, and you want to stop the access to that thing, obviously. And these things, you don't know what you're buying, and they're toxic. And, I don't know the answer of why these folks are making things this way, but my assumption is you don't want to kill your customer pipeline, right? So I don't think that that's what's happening here, but these are accidental. But we saw this before there was synthetics with heroin and stuff, which is when the heroin was exceedingly pure and there was an overdose that occurred, you would have a migration of heroin addicts to the same dealer to try and purchase more of the heroin because they just believed they would be getting more, it was really good, and they could control the amount and not die, but have a much better experience with that. So when there is an overdose in communities, we've known this since the 60s, even in pockets in African American and other communities of use, that there would be a flock or a flooding of that dealer to try to get that same drug. So there is that, but I don't think the reason is to kill folks in the pipeline. But I will say this, which I didn't mention: secure injection facilities, which are places that you could go to safely use that have a nurse present that can help you, as well as mobile drug purity testing, so that you could take your drug safely without fear of being arrested to test it to see how potent it is or how dangerous it is, are two strategies that are evidence-based strategies. They are already implementing them in some places, like in Canada, or places in Canada and in Europe. And these are two things that we really need to do. And I hate to say it this way, but imagine if that boy had access to a way to test these drugs before he used them. So,
I've been looking for a video or some presentation on the science of addiction to bring to our congregation.
Okay.
And it would be great if you could come, but I don't think you can fit it in
Where
your
are you?
schedule.
Where do you live?
St. Paul.
Okay, all right, well, I get here.
But, so, do you have a video? Are you aware of any current engaging videos on the science of addiction?
Yes, there is one that's really good, and I can see his face, and I'm picturing him, Kevin, who knows what I'm talking about, the doc who did the periodic table of, does anybody know?
is it the Pleasure Unwoven?
Yeah, Pleasure Unwoven, and his second one, though, his second one that just came out, which is really good, and it updates with the modern science. So
Oh,
Pleasure
good.
Unwoven, but his second one, whatever that's
Okay,
called.
because
Yeah.
Pleasure Unwoven.
No, that's old
is
school.
dated.
Yeah, this is new. It came out last year. It's really good, actually.
Okay.
So look at and turn off the camera because I don't want him to think I can't remember his name. So it's like when someone asks you, you can't remember. But he's a good friend of mine. But anyway, Pleasure Unwoven Part 2 came out last year. Really good.
And you do one too.
Well, I don't record mine, so
Well, sometimes.
yeah. Well, okay, I'll come out to St. Paul. So I love St. Paul.
Okay, forgive my ignorance, but when you say, I'm right over here.
Hi.
Okay, forgive my ignorance, but you said the reason why we're worried about opiates is because because alcohol is killing all the right people.
Right. So it's yeah.
What is opiates killing? What is
Right.
alcohol killing?
Good. Okay,
Because-
that's not ignorance. It's a very legitimate question. So what I said was the reason we don't pay attention to alcohol is because it's not killing the right people. Now, there's a longer story here. And the story is that opioids have been killing people for a long time. In the 60s and 70s, there were communities of colors that were decimated by opioids, but we didn't pay attention. We didn't care. It was criminal. By the way, we call it a war when it's African American, right? We had a drug war, a crack war. We call it a crisis when it's white and suburban. That's the language. So when I think about killing white people, what what I mean is that alcohol is killing over a longer period of time, it's older folks, and it's more diverse in terms of its distribution, whereas this is killing young white suburban children. Now, that's part A of the answer to your question. Part B is now the opioid epidemic has spread and it's killing everybody. So now it's no longer confined to that, but it's too late. We already decided this was a crisis, not a war. We already decided it affected suburban white America, so we've already set our language on this. So therefore, we're going to call it a crisis, not a war. But had this gone to the African American communities or other disenfranchised communities, it would be a war. So we make that decision not based on utility, but based on a desire to essentially continue to subjugate a portion of our population. So, yeah. Yes.
Can you talk about the role of complementary therapies in neurotransmitter stimulation, dopamine release, and so forth?
Yeah, sure. So I'm like really the wrong person to ask about this because I'm not a huge supporter of those. So my view is that the resources should be deployed against things for which there's really solid evidence, and there's so many things for which there is evidence that we're not paying for before we go paying for things that we haven't fully tested or vetted yet. That's an unpopular view. So I'm kind of the wrong person to ask that question to, but I don't actually believe we should be committing our national resources towards interventions that are not yet fully tested or vetted when we have existing interventions that we know will help people that are underfunded. And so that's why I tend to do that. I'm not opposed to anybody personally doing that, but in terms from a public health perspective, from the distribution of resources perspective, I'm not as in favor of such approaches, except for the few for which there is evidence to support them, right? So like, for example, there's acupuncture for detox is one that has some evidence that supports. Clearly there's evidence around certain types of meditation supporting outcomes and mindfulness meditation and other. So if something's been studied, vetted, and actually meets the Cochrane level of database, in other words, not just you had a study or two that you read about in, whatever, Newsweek or Time or USA Today, but something that's had multiple large-scale randomized trials and you have outcomes on it. Yeah, good.
Good morning. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank
I'm
you.
the Christian minister daughter of a biology teacher, so
In Nebraska?
I'm from Iowa. I'm in exile right now. But, I'm wandering and
Okay, wondering.
But no, it's a huge passion of mine that science and faith be BFFs, and so I just really appreciate you being here. And I am sitting here with huge anxiety that I don't want to medicate, to ask about your own personal background and culture, and if there's religious background, if there's a faith background, and just bring that into the conversation,
right.
if you're comfortable with it.
Right,
if you're not, but I believe our brains evolved, so it's safe space.
Right. So let's have that conversation. Maybe not up here from the stage, but let's have that conversation. And my background essentially was that I was raised Muslim. So I am a Muslim, and I noticed, I had some interesting observations as a child and as a young adult. Nobody in my family drank. Nobody in my family used any drugs. But we weren't white as the driven snow either. So I have an amazing family, but we had our challenges. And one thing I learned early on is my family had come from a dry state in India called Gujarat. It's a very large state. It's the size of Texas, right? It's a very large state. It's a dry state. And you may know that Hindus and Muslims aren't necessarily the best friends in India, right? So, although we make an effort to do that, and my father put together a thing where Muslim doctors would go into Hindu communities and treat for free, and Hindu doctors would go into Muslim, because that's how you do it, right? So, but anyway, I learned, at a certain point, it was transformative for me to learn that the majority of bootlegged alcohol in Gujarat was manufactured and sold by Muslims. And it really opened my eyes, because I grew up in an insular American kind of, my father came over here when Martin Luther King was shot, and he's a physician, and he tried to import the religion to this country, which at that time it just considered us weird and odd and different, not, terrorists, but we were just sort of viewed as separate in some ways. Then 9/11 happened, and everything changed for us, right? So, but before that time, it was more sort of like, oh, okay, it's kind of like you're at the airport and you see the Mennonites. It's like, well, which one are you? Are you the Amish or the Mennonite? I don't know which color the hat is or whatever. We don't know that because you don't pay attention to it. So that's how we were treated at that point. But, there's more to the story than I could share with you, but I became a psychiatrist. I was interested in psychiatry, and I talk a little bit about this on my website, so you can look at that too. But I had no interest in treating addiction, none. And then my best friend died of a heroin overdose, and I felt responsible for that. And so I started to ask myself the question, which many of you ask yourself, and perhaps maybe even be the reason you're here: what could I have done differently? What could I have done differently? What if there had been a drug purity testing? What if a gal talked to me about her child who's in prison right now from heroin overdose? What if there had been access to supportive treatment and buprenorphine and other things and long-term support? You know, all these questions I started asking myself. So I was like, all right, I'm going to go do this and see what happens. And you know, like anything else, I mean, most people who become experts not so much by books, but by listening to their patients and family members and loved ones. So I did all the books later, but I started with the kind of listening to people like you. That was my journey.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And like anything else, there's more to the story. Yes, you were. Okay, sorry.
So thank you for sharing with us.
Yeah.
So I am from Ohio.
Okay. What did I get wrong?
Well, no, really. So from sharing with us what Ohio has done wrong,
right.
Which is a lot. I guess I'm curious, you shared last night about being in the rooms with the insurance companies and
Yeah,
so
sure,
kind
yeah.
of at the upper levels
Yes.
there. I'm curious about from a systems approach politically
Right.
and looking at those kinds of systems.
Right.
Because this is so complex.
Right.
And I spend a lot of time in prison as
Right.
well, and then you talked about that interplay.
Right.
So that's a pretty complex question, but
Right.
what you would advocate for, or how we could speak into those systems,
Right.
for what to advocate for, what changes, how to speak into the political system
Right.
around what needs to
Right,
change.
right. How do you advocate for yourself in that? And so, like the compliment, I'm sort of the wrong person to ask because like I'm actually blocked from calling my local legislator. Like they will not, you know. I met him at the one time at the polling line, and he gave me his cell phone number. He regrets it. So I'm